If you've been around here for any length of time, you'll know that I'm pretty much a fanboy of anything related to N64 magazine. It was a magazine which defined a specific era in my life. It was packed with a team of writers who weren't bound by political correctness or had Nintendo's oppressive restrictions that the official Nintendo magazine had. For myself and many others, this magazine was the pinnacle when it came to video game journalism. However, that's not to say that I always agreed 100% with what the magazine had to say, and sometimes, just when you think you knew one of the journalists after reading their work for so long, they would throw out a review that left you thinking they know nothing about video games at all. So for today's video, I'm taking a look at the history of N64 magazine to find reviews which I think were the most outrageous. In the comments section down below, I'd love for you to let me know any times from any era of gaming where you saw or read a review which you felt was absolutely off the mark. And as always, if you're wanting my view on any of the games featured in today's episode, then head on down to the description box where I'll link you up to the reviews I've covered over the years I've been doing this channel. Cruis'n USA was an early Nintendo 64 title which landed in 1996 in North America, but 14 months later in Europe. The game was announced before the N64 launch, and it was touted as being an arcade-perfect port of the popular racing game which players loved for its simplicity to pick up and play. When reviewed in issue 13 of N64 magazine, however, the game was panned with a score of 24%, and Tim Weaver, who was a big fan favourite on the writing team, didn't hold back, describing the game as having only one redeeming feature, which was its visuals, and that's simply for the fact it doesn't have notorious N64 fuzz that the console was already becoming known for at that point. What perhaps didn't help here was that although the game got okay scores in North American publications, due to it being a very early release after the console's launch, the PAL version arriving after the likes of Top Gear Rally really didn't help this one's chances. In a savage breakdown, he describes the audio as having awful music, like listening to the Shadows playing their first ever gig. The lifespan of the game as being shorter than an episode of EastEnders, which was a 30-minute soap opera that's been going on for forever here in the UK, and he wrapped things up by calling the game a grade Z stinker. Saying that, however, I think that 24% is just absolutely savage and way too harsh. Look, it was by no means that bad, and if you consider that at the time the game was only £35 here in the UK brand new, and in comparison to say Turok, which was retailing around the £70 mark, I think anyone picking up the game on its launch would have known what to expect. As I mentioned in my review of the game, it's just so simplistic, and it's the kind of game that's enjoyable for the fact that you can just pick it up, blast through the entire game without much thought and have fun doing so. Way back in issue 1 of N64 magazine, the team reviewed an import copy of the game, and even way back then they gave the game a paltry 34%, and that was without the competition that came between the North American and European releases. To help justify its score, they mentioned that even at the time they were in the era of Sega Rally and Ridge Racer, and so Cruis'n USA seemed stuck in the past and hadn't made an effective jump into the modern era. The game's always divided opinion on N64, so let me know in the comments what score you think this game honestly deserves. Bomberman as a series is one which has admittedly seen many highs but equally as many lows. Even on the Nintendo 64 there's a distinct hierarchy of the 4 Bomberman games released on the system, but way back in issue 8 of N64 magazine they gave the console's first Bomberman 50%. Admittedly, the import review was written by Mr. Nicholson, who wasn't, in my opinion, one of the stronger writers on the early magazine's team. It seems that from his review he was focusing the review entirely on the game being a multiplayer experience, instead of leaving the single player game as an afterthought. The problem with that view, however, is that whilst Bomberman 64 did have a basic multiplayer offering, it was marketed on being a single player experience foremost, with a storyline, different worlds to explore, puzzles to solve and items to obtain to customise your character. It's quite a lengthy review, and instead it focuses far too much on nitpicking the slim multiplayer offering and comparing it against the previous generation's games which were more multiplayer focused. I'd also argue with this statement that the game's puzzles are far too easy. While sure there's some balancing issues throughout the game, where some puzzles are incredibly easy, there's also some fiendishly difficult ones that require a ton of skill to achieve and solve. He is perhaps the most savage when he says that, quite simply, Hudson's designers have lost the plot, after waxing lyrical about how much the Office team used to love playing Bomberman on the Super Nintendo when the magazine was known as Super Play and it covered the SNES. Although I will admit that Bomberman 64 is probably my least favourite of the 4 offerings on N64, it's way better than 50% score it was given here, and I think I'd be really surprised if anyone who's completed the game would agree with that score in the comment section below. For me, I'd probably now put it in the upper 70% bracket. It's by no means perfect or a must-own title, but it has a lot of personality in it, and while some of the later entries on the N64 became fast-paced, this one has a little bit more of a relaxing nature to it, and it puts itself in a great position where it doesn't directly compete with the console's masterful platform games. We've looked so far at 2 titles which I felt got scores which were too low, but there are also some times where the magazine gave out a seemingly insane score for a game which is commonly known as being quite poor. Take the case of South Park Rally for instance. The trilogy of South Park games on the Nintendo 64 are so bad that even Matt Stone and Trey Parker admitted that they were terrible, and it was one of the reasons they waited so long to make more South Park video games and also demand full creative control over any future games. Way back in issue 38 of N64 magazine, Mark Green reviewed the game and scored it an incredible 88%, which ranks it as one of the console's best overall racing games. Now I don't know if Mark Green was high at the time, but aside from that guy, who will no doubt make themselves known in the comments, who will think this is the best video game ever made, the overriding opinion of the gaming masses is that this is a pretty bad game. You have the dire point-to-point racing style which I always found made the game horrible to play, and yet the magazine marks this as being one of the game's cool, innovative features. Mark Green laughably finished the review by saying Nintendo should watch their backs. If anyone at Nintendo saw this game, they'd be more likely to be tearing its shortcomings to pieces rather than worrying about it taking Mario Kart's crown. I will however give a little leeway here. The game was released at a time when South Park Fever was still the rage, and anything related to the TV show was a cash printing machine. If anyone like me is old enough, you'll remember the Simpsons craze when the TV show first started, and I would remember trying to get anything Simpsons related, and it was incredibly hard because the merch would just sell out everywhere. The same hype too could be felt for South Park, at least here in the UK anyway. Showing that he was absolutely out of his mind when writing the review, Mark Green also stated, when talking about the game's visuals, that Jet Force Gemini and Donkey Kong 64 proved that you don't need good visuals to have fun in a game. Let that comparison sink in for a moment. 2 of the best looking games on Nintendo 64 being compared to this absolute train wreck of a game. Just when you think this review wouldn't get more laughably bad, he then goes on to write that you couldn't ask for more than South Park Rally. Near the end of the review, he says that while South Park and Chef's Love Shack were good but clearly rushed cash-in games, South Park Rally was the total package. Mark Green may have given this game a score of 88%, but I'm giving this review a score of 12%, and a reminder to stay off drugs everyone. Shadowgate 64 is one of the most atmospheric, unique and haunting experiences you can find on Nintendo 64. Whilst visually it's not the prettiest game on the system, the eerie castle exploration like gameplay, combined with creepy characters and music that will etch itself into your soul, makes this one of the games which I love speaking about to other fans. Speaking of fans however, it's clear that in issue 31 of N64 magazine, Jez Bickham, who reviewed the game, wasn't a fan, and slapped a review score of 43% on it. I actually don't mind Jez most of the time, but I think he was way off the mark with this one. He criticises the game for its trial and error approach to exploration, which for any long-time Shadowgate fans from previous generations, you'll be all too familiar with. He also criticises the fact that you need to collect what seems like an endless amount of items in the game, with some having no specific uses, but again that's something which adds to the game's puzzle-like storyline. I did however love Jez's witty comment. He says that a plus of the game is that it's like you're stuck in a castle on your own, and that he found the storyline to be mildly intriguing. In terms of the game's negatives, he brutally stated that this game shows it's almost like as if Zelda had never happened. Any comparison to Zelda is perhaps a little harsh, as they are entirely different games, and most likely I think they'll have appealed to different audiences. I think if you're a fan of point and click style games, then this is perhaps as close to one as you'll get on Nintendo 64, aside from importing a copy of the Wonder Project J2. Worst of all though, he gave the game's music a score of 3 out of 10, and seems as I've added one of the game's music pieces over the game footage you're now watching, I think you'll agree it's actually damn catchy and it fits the creepy style of the game perfectly. I would also question here though also how far Jez actually got into the game. The screenshots used, from my memory at least, all appear to be from the first part of the game, and the fact that in the final paragraph of his review he states that you'll get bored within 20 minutes, and I think that may be about as far into the game as he actually got. Shadowgate 64 is a game which was incredibly rare to find on its release here in the UK, and I know across the world it wasn't shipped in large volumes, and so I'd love to hear from anyone else who has played the game before in the comments down below what your opinions of it were and what score you would give the game. I know it won't be everybody's cup of tea, but this game is a special place to me, and I think that 43% is just far too critical of a review. When you think of Disney video games, you often think back to the golden era of the NES and Super Nintendo. But that's not to say that the Nintendo 64 was lacking when it came to Disney licensed video games. I did a whole video on the subject, but for this mention we're looking at Tarzan. Reviewed in issue 40 of N64 magazine by Martin Kitts, he instead recommends Yoshi's Story as it's a game produced by people who knew what they were doing, after hammering Tarzan with a score of 35%. He opens a review by saying that whilst the screenshots the reader is looking at may fool them, he feels that the gameplay would have been considered dull and unimaginative even in 1984. I don't know what games he was playing in 1984 that the rest of us weren't playing, but for this game it's far better than he's making out here. It's clear that Martin had it in for the game right from the start when he said that the game must have been designed by someone who had never experienced a Mario title in their life. He also highlighted his key negatives of the game, which include it having soul-destroying gameplay, being frustrating, badly designed and overall rubbish. I disagree with all of those, and in fact the only part of his review I seem to agree with is that the game is relatively easy. He does make a good point however, asking why Tarzan, who's a supposed friend of the animals, is being attacked constantly in the game by animals, and also he has to kill many of these animals as he progresses through the levels. But that's video game logic which still exists today in many titles. Perhaps the funniest line of the review is when Martin says that in the first level Tarzan develops a taste for carving up monkeys, and if DK found out he'd go ape. Sadly, whilst this review does have its comedic elements I always appreciated, overall it's just far too savage in my opinion. I'd perhaps have doubled the score to the low 70s on this one, and I feel that visually it's one of the nicer looking third party games on the console. The music is fairly memorable, and in terms of gameplay it is an enjoyable romp from start to finish, and it doesn't flesh itself out with meaningless side tasks during an entertaining single player story mode. When it comes to cult classics on the N64, I think there's a good shout that along with Battle Tanks, Army Men is another franchise that fans seem to love but critics dislike. No surprises then that in issue 36 of N64 magazine it landed a paltry 67% score. But wait Glenn, that's a fairly respectable score, I hear you cry. Well, in my opinion I think it was too harsh, and I think easily it's a game which should have been in say the high 70s or more likely low 80% scoring games. Jez Bickham once again took the writing duties of this review, and when you'd see a game get a half-page review you often knew right away that it wasn't going to be highly rated. Now to give Jez some credit here, this issue of the magazine was the Christmas edition and it was absolutely loaded with stellar games, and so I can see that in comparison when he was writing the review there would have been a whole ton of other games in the office he'd rather be playing. His main criticisms of the game are the poor controls and dodgy camera, but he does praise the game's unique concepts and arsenal of weapons. When I take issue with the most though is that he mentions nothing about the game's multiplayer fun, aside from the lifespan section where he says 4 players helps the game's longevity. Now this was never a GoldenEye, Mario Kart 64 or WWF No Mercy multiplayer beta, but its multiplayer mode is one of the more enjoyable ones on the console. My suspicion here is that the entire magazine didn't give the multiplayer mode here a proper thrashing, which would have bumped the score up higher. As I mentioned before, given this issue of the magazine featured Donkey Kong 64, Super Smash Bros, Resident Evil 2, WWF WrestleMania 2000, Xena Warrior Princess, Gauntlet Legends and Worms Armageddon, to name just a few of the reviews, it's fair to say that spending too much time on a review for Army Men wasn't top of anyone's agenda. With the magazine being known for sometimes arriving on store shelves late, this Christmas issue is one nobody could afford to miss the deadline on, and so I suspect that this review was cobbled together in a few hours, and then quickly freeing Jez up to get back to playing Smash Brothers with the rest of the chaps in the office. After WWF Warzone had been a game which I had enjoyed, and yes, I know that at the time WCW games were better, but with all the promised upgrades which Acclaim were promising for this sequel, I couldn't help but get excited. I remember watching preview information for months come into the magazine, and as time went by getting more and more hyped for the game's eventual release. I would call my local game shop every weekend to ask them if they had heard any finalised release dates from their distributor, trying to find out before reading my beloved N64 magazine. So when issue 32 arrived with a full review written by Mark Green, my excitement went into overdrive when I saw the final review score of 88%. This rated this game as one of the best wrestling games ever, and so far the best wrestling game on the console. This ensured that I would do everything I possibly could to get this game on its launch day. And that I did. But what I was left with after a few hours was a feeling that this was nothing more than an expanded WWF Warzone, and trying to spot the improvements that Acclaim had been touting as being game-changing were becoming harder and harder to see. Similar to my comments on South Park Rally, I feel that the review here at the peak of the WWF Attitude era bumped up the score considerably. In the UK, at least for this time, you could find people who you wouldn't consider wrestling purists suddenly wearing Stone Cold 316 t-shirts, and people doing the people's eyebrow anytime they had their photo taken. Now, we all get carried away at times, but if you consider that No Mercy, considered by many as the best wrestling game ever made, would score 92% in the future, then it's hard to justify how they came up with the score for WWF Warzone just a few percentage points lower. I would also point out for anyone who doesn't know the magazine that most games scoring over 85% would get a star award, which means that the magazine was personally recommending it as being a must-own title. There were some exceptions to this rule, but as a general rule of thumb, if you saw a star award for a game, you'd have a damn good time playing it, and if you were gaming on a budget, then these were typically the games that you would go for. Anyone who would say that this game is a must-own title is clearly on another planet, because giving the game a 9 out of 10 for visuals is a joke, as although the character models are higher resolution, the animation here is just terrible and janky. Mark Green also states that the Creator Wrestler mode alone is worth the price of the game. Considering the game cost £40 on its launch here in the UK, I don't think that there would have been a queue of people buying the game to dress up a few beefy blokes. Now hold your breath here. They had previously given WCW vs NWO Revenge a score of just 75%. And so, in Mark Green's opinion, this game was severely better than WCW vs NWO Revenge. No chance at all, Mr. Green. Back to journalism school for you, we think. And so there you have it. There's my roundup of the times when I think N64 Magazine's stellar team of journalists missed the mark, phoned it in, or quite simply didn't play enough of the game to give a fair opinion. Can you think of any other times N64 Magazine got their score so wrong? I'll probably have to dig through those copies for the official N64 magazine to do a similar video, but given how biased they were, I think the list would be much, much longer. As always though, thank you for watching, and until next time.